Despite American presidents and military leaders providing years of positive assessments that the U.S. was winning the war in Afghanistan, behind the scenes there were clear warnings that things were headed in another direction. Those harbingers, stories of failure, corruption, and lack of a clear strategy, are the focus of Washington Post reporter Craig Whitlock's new book, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. And Craig joins us now. Thank you so much for being here. Congratulations. This is a definitive book. Craig Whitlock, you interviewed over 1,000 people, and you had access to documents that your newspaper, the Washington Post, had to sue to get. And they tell a very different story in many cases from what the public's been told over the last 20 years, don't they?
Yeah, these documents were interviews with the core of them with more than 400 officials who played a key role in the war. And this is from White House officials to generals, diplomats, aid workers, and also Afghans. And they thought these were confidential interviews the government had conducted, and they thought that their assessments were brutal. They said that the U.S. government didn't know what it was doing in Afghanistan, it didn't have a strategy, and it misled the American people about how the war was going for 20 years. So it was a complete opposite of the message that was being delivered in public year after year, that the U.S. was making progress, that victory was around the corner.
And this goes back to the very beginning. I mean, President Bush the U.S. goes into Afghanistan initially to get Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attacks, but it very quickly changes to nation building. And you have a lot of behind-the-scenes information from then on about how what was going on, what was being assessed, was different from what people were told.
Well, and one of the earliest examples of this is President Bush gave a speech in April of 2002 to the Virginia Military Institute. And at that time, the Taliban had been defeated, al-Qaeda was on the run, but Bush was addressing concerns already that Afghanistan could turn into a quagmire like Vietnam, or like what had happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan or the British in the 19th century. And he was dismissing these concerns, saying, don't worry, we won't get bogged down, this isn't going to happen to us. On that very same day Bush gave the speech, his defense secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, dictated a memo to several of his generals and top aides at the Pentagon, and he said the exact opposite. He expressed this real fear that we could get bogged down. He said, if we don't come up with a plan to stabilize Afghanistan, we'll never get the troops out. And he ended the memo with one word. It said, help, exclamation point, on the very same day. I mean, this happened with all the presidents. People may recall back in 2014, President Obama said that the war was coming to a conclusion. There was actually a ceremony in Kabul at NATO headquarters in which the U.S. officials said that the combat mission for U.S. troops was over. And yet, behind the scenes, the Pentagon and Obama all knew that U.S. troops were still going to be in harm's way, and people were still dying in combat for the duration of the war. More than 100 people died in Afghanistan, U.S. troops, after Obama said that mission was coming to an end.
And Craig Whitlock, you cite one military leader after another. I'm thinking of General David Petraeus, who's been out very critical lately of President Biden, saying that he should have realized that the Afghan military was helping fight off ISIS and al-Qaeda. But you cite him and other military leaders telling Congress, again, as you're saying now, that things were going well.
Month after month, year after year, under Bush, Obama, and Trump, that the Afghan army and police forces were capable of defending their own country, that they no longer needed U.S. troops to fight the Taliban in ground combat. And yet, in these interviews in the Afghanistan papers, U.S. military trainers and other officials were sending up highly critical reports of the Afghan forces. They said they couldn't shoot straight, they were illiterate, their leaders were corrupt, and they expressed real doubt that they could stand up in a fight to the Taliban. So the Pentagon has known this for many years, and yet, again, as you said, in public, they kept telling the American people that everything was going according to plan. In these interviews in the Afghanistan papers, generals, ambassadors, other people, they were very blunt. They said, we didn't know what we were doing in Afghanistan. They literally would say this. We never understood the country. In the early years, there was no strategy. So it really was worse than people thought.
And we hear President Biden today saying, among other things, that he really had no choice, that President Trump had negotiated this withdrawal.
I think he's right. If we were going to try and have a military victory over the Taliban, which is highly dubious, we would have had to commit more troops and double down on the fighting there. And that was something that Biden didn't want to do. The irony here is we don't learn these lessons from history. At the beginning of the war, Bush and Rumsfeld and others, again, they said, we learned our lesson from Vietnam. We're not going to do that again. So they knew about it, but it still happened. And I think sometimes we turn a blind eye to history and we forget. And we had a lot of hubris in Afghanistan that we thought we could do something that clearly in retrospect failed. I think the Biden administration is going to be slow to recognize give diplomatic recognition to the Taliban, but they've already started to do business with them militarily. And you may recall that the CIA director, Bill Burns, made a visit to Kabul recently to meet with the Taliban leadership. So I think on counterterrorism operations against groups like the Islamic State, I think the U.S. and the Taliban will probably work together fairly closely. They just may keep it hidden from the public.
Which is what so much of the book is about.